Hello, Nathan here with Modern Deployment IT blog, where my goal is to provide reliable, real-world IT guides and experiences from the field. Today, we're going to be discussing the new SCCM 1909 technical preview feature and reviewing it, the MBAM feature that was released yesterday with 1909, and the improvements to Bitlocker Management. So this is an exciting update from Microsoft. The previous version of technical preview, it just had the MBAM configuration client setting in the console, and that was it. So now they released the WebInstaller, the reports, and other configurations that you are used to with MBAM. Again, this is native to SCCM. So let's get into this discussion today. Okay, let's get started. Alrighty. So our agenda is to review the installation of the WebInstaller for MBAM. Again, this is on the Microsoft website. It has a list of the requirements as well as some of the different features that we're going to go over today. Viewing the reports, the MBAM reports, how to use the MBAM administration and monitoring website, how to use the SelfService Portal, and then the other agenda topic I wanted to go through is the actual client management, and in particular migration questions. What happens if you have an existing MBAM client managed through Active Directory group policy for the MBAM client, or you have an existing standalone? Typically, when you transition from a different infrastructure for an MBAM client, it's just a matter of pointing the client to the new server, and it will re-escrow the keys if the machine is already encrypted. So let's get into these topics today. It's pretty cool. They came out with a PowerShell script to install the MBAM server role. We'll install that on our SCCM site server on the technical preview installation we have. It has the SelfService Portal now, as mentioned earlier, as well as the Helpdesk Portal. It has HTTPS listed here, but in my lab, I'm going to be using HTTP because I don't have SSL configured with certificates and whatnot. Some of the requirements. So we need to install the reporting services point. I've already done that. In my lab, I actually have that on another server, a completely different server. The other item that we need to do is obviously IIS is installed. I'm going to be installing the IIS web server component on the same SCCM site server. In this case, in the production environment, you could split those rows out into different servers for capacity planning, especially when you had a large number of client devices checking in and out. The operating system that the server runs for this role, in this case, I'm using Server 2019 in my lab. It also does require, if you're familiar with the MBAM configuration currently, you have to have the ASP.NET MVC 4.0 installer. We'll need to install that on the web server. You also, when you're running this process, the user account that runs MBAM installer script, that PowerShell script, needs to have SQL sysadmin rights on the SCCM site database server, right? So this is integrated with SCCM, so it's not like standalone. So wherever the SCCM, or excuse me, the SQL site database is, you need to have sysadmin rights on that particular server. This is a pitfall with a lot of customers I see when they try to install or integrate things with SCCM. There's just this struggle with understanding the rights. So make sure you have the proper rights. During the setup process, as it mentions here, the script sets the login, the user, and the SQL Server roles for the web server machine account. That's why it needs to have sysadmin rights. It has to be able to update the database with the new MBAM information at this point. We're also going to create, I've already pre-created the 3 accounts that you're familiar with. So you have the help desk, or like a level 1, where they don't have full access to the MBAM recovery keys. Typically, I just recommend customers focus on the middle group permissions. So these are AD groups that need to be created. So MBAM Helpdesk Admin Group Level 2. However you want to name it, just make sure you understand that this is the account that has access to all the recovery areas of the administration and monitoring website. And then the final one is MBAM Reports Read-Only Group. This is a group that has access to read the reports on from the reporting server or through the console. So interesting that this is going to basically be in the console, the SCCM reports, so not like standalone. So this is going to be very cool. Okay, so let's get into the demo. So again, we'll be running the MBAM website installer PowerShell script. We'll go over where that's at, and I would personally like to see I'm sure this is an okay feature, but it would be better in my opinion if this was just simply a wizard, just like adding a server row in SCCM is currently. Maybe a wizard that would just say, where do you want to put the MBAM server and where is your report server, etc. We'll look at the SCCM MBAM reports, the self-service portal, and finally, what does the MBAM client management look like? So let's have a look at my environment. So I have three systems going on here. So I have my technical preview installation of 1909. I've already upgraded to that. I also have my reporting server. In my case, is not co-located on the SCCM site server. It's a separate server. I was testing something separately. And then finally, I have my client. So on my client machine, again, like always, when you do a SCCM, whether it's technical preview or production environment, make sure your client version matches what your server is. So let's double check that indeed we are on 1909. If we go to updates and servicing, I've already performed the update. Notice the client version is 5.008884.1000, and that matches the client that we have in this case. So on our server, if you remember, again, I believe it was technical preview 1905. It came out with, really the only option you had here was to create a BitLocker policy. Interesting enough, when I upgraded to 1909 yesterday, the existing policy I created from 1905, it just gives me this error where it won't recognize it. It won't let me click on any of the tabs. So I just had to create a new one. Here, I created a new one and basically have the similar configuration. So I'd like to see this section right here say Windows 7 or Windows 8.1 and previous versions. That's really what that should say, I believe, because this obviously says Windows 10 here. And I'm going to enable XTS AES 256. And then for the operating system, for this policy setting, I'm going to say yes, enabled, allow BitLocker without TPM, no. I'm not going to set a pin. I'm just going to use TPM only, so no TPM and pin. On the VM that I have here, I'm going to attempt to use the built-in mechanism for TPM. It's already enabled, so I tested that. It should work with this as well. We'll see. But ultimately, we obviously want to see the client install, right? So let's try to get that to happen. Third tab, client management. So this is equivalent. So again, there's no group policy settings for this. This is the setting. So you go into assets and compliance, expand endpoint protection, click on BitLocker Management, and you create your policy just like you would if it was a regular group policy. So in my case, I do not have, any MBAM or BitLocker group policies, right? All I have is the default domain policy and default domain controller policy. No settings related to BitLocker or MBAM. So in your production environment or in your dev environment, you're obviously going to want to, disable any MBAM or BitLocker policies you have, just so that it doesn't conflict with what you're trying to do here in this environment. So, okay, so we're on 1909, we're good there. What else? So that's good. So now, once you upgrade to 1909, what happens is, in the program files directory, Microsoft Configuration Manager, bin x64, there's these two cab files that you need to copy out of here and run. So essentially, you run this PowerShell script, it looks for this cab file, of course, and I've already done that. I've copied that to the temp directory. I've also copied out the PowerShell command line that needs to run. You can find this information. I'll have it linked in the at the end of the article. It's basically right here. When you look at the Microsoft website for 1909 features, technical preview, you'll notice here are the prerequisites. Here's the script usage. So they have the parameters here. Again, I personally would like for this to be a wizard. within SCCM natively. This is not a problem, not a big deal, but it'd be better if it was just a simple wizard, in my opinion. The same URL. So once we finish running that PowerShell script, we're going to copy these to a local folder somewhere else, like we mentioned earlier, and run this PowerShell script with the various parameters for what's the MBAM reporting user group, what's the helpdesk admin group, what's the helpdesk user group, etc., the reporting services URL, and that's what I have here in this text file. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run that. So what we need to do, let's just run an elevated PowerShell command. And we are probably going to need to set the execution policy to, let's set it to bypass, just so we don't have any red issues. Okay, that's good. So let's copy that line. So I've already pre-populated. Well, before I run it, let's step back a second here. So I've already created the group. So again, the prerequisites here from the PowerPoint that we were showing here, you need to create these 3 groups, these 3 service accounts. Just AD groups, right? So this is just a standard global security group. I've added the local administrator account because I'm logged in as administrator here for the purposes of this demo. I've also added an admin account just to kind of test that. And then level 1, this is the one that doesn't have full access. So normally, again, like I mentioned before, I would stick to one group and just add the help desk to one group. I don't see a real advantage of splitting those out. You know, the help desk needs to see the recovery keys, right? To, you know, when there's a BitLocker recovery event. So no sense in splitting that out unnecessarily. And you could. So, but for the installation, you need all 3 is the point. Okay, you can't skip this. And then you have the read-only MBAM report so that they can see the MBAM reports. I've added now. This is not MBAM standalone, right? So this is integrated with SCCM. So I would imagine you also need to give the users that need to run the reports, you need to add them, I would imagine, to the security groups so that they can obviously run reports from the monitoring node, right? So, you know, this is not if you were going to give them console access. So actually, you should be able to run the reports through the website. So at the end, when we're finished, without the SCCM console, we should be able to, assuming those users are in that group, they should be able to access this URL independent of the SCCM console. So that way you don't have to delegate, you know, managers or other people that need to run reports. You don't have to give them access to the SCCM console, even though you as an admin, as SCCM admin, can see the reports. So if you go to monitoring, expand reporting, and expand reports, you'll see there's a new node here once you install 1909 for the BitLocker reports and for English recovery audit reports. We'll get into that after we install the roles. But the point I'm making is the read-only users would access this URL and not the SCCM console. You don't want to have to delegate multiple people just to look at reports, giving them read-only access in the console. Even though you technically can, that's the purpose of that. So again, make sure you have the AD groups created. I do in this case. Okay, so let's close this. We got multiple windows open. So we're going to copy this syntax. And now, before we run that, we need to make sure that we have ASP MVC4 installed. I've already installed that, so that's already installed on my site server in this case. In your case, you may have your web server on a different machine. It's up to you. Before we actually run this, let's also look at, so that's installed. I didn't have to reboot, by the way. Let's look at what IIS looks like before we run the install. Okay, so under default sites, you just see this. This is the default, standard, virtual directories you have for SCCM installation in general. Okay, if you look at this and go to Explore, you'll notice this is the recovery and hardware service. So basically, when you configure group policy, or if you're doing it in a task sequence, you can specify when you do the invoke script for the client install, for the MBAM client install, you specify the recovery and hardware service, the core services URL. Well, this is where that's housed. So that's there before we do the installation of this. Okay, so we've installed this component already. Now we hit enter and off it goes. Another thing too is if you have your IIS installation in a different directory besides C, you would need to specify that parameter. I noticed that here in the documentation down here it mentions the IIS installation directory. There's a parameter here. It looks like a parameter. It says IIS website, but it doesn't. Have to play around with that. So looks like it's a parameter to do that, to change the default location if it's on D or another drive. Okay, so it's finished. So that's that. So now let's open IIS and see what it looks like now. Okay, so here's our help desk portal. If we go to Explore, again, this is our help desk website. And then if we go to self-service, this is where people that are not in IT could run the self-service portal. So now, according to the documentation, we should be able to access our portal from a web browser. So let's double check that. So again, I'm not using HTTPS. I am going to provide the fully qualified name. Let's see. Okay, so that's the default self-service portal. So if I needed to, so this is the portal again that you're used to with MBAM in general, or MBAM or Bitlocker, or not Bitlocker, but with MBAM, where the end users in your community go and recover their own drives for whatever reason they might come into, right? So that is working great. And again, in a production environment, we would use SSL, HTTPS certificates, and not just HTTP. It's not recommended to do this like we're doing in the lab. So always good to check your URL. Okay, great. So these are so I'm in that group that allows me to see everything basically in the recovery keys. So essentially I could type in the username. The only fields that are required is what this little red star is. So a user is in a recovery state, they, you know, maybe they changed the BIOS or they installed a driver, they did something like normally you put in the first 8 characters of the recovery, the ID for the drive, for the encrypted drive, and pick a reason, and this is good. So let's see about the reports. Okay, recovery audit reports. So good. This is working, so my permission is working on that. All right, so the URLs are working is the point. So that's all good. Nothing we need to do there. Now let's look at the SCCM console. Let's just close the SCCM console and open again. So the next thing I want to do is let's look and see what they say about validation here. So if we go on the MBAM server in Event Viewer, we should be able to go to this location and we should see some validations for the self-service portal and the help desk. Let's look at that. So let's go to Event Viewer. Event Viewer under Microsoft MBAM server. Oh, Microsoft Windows MBAM. Microsoft Windows MBAM. I don't see MBAM server. Okay. Okay, I didn't set a service principal name, so I'm not going to worry about that now. I was still able to access the website. The administration website application successfully found and connect to a supported version of a recovery database. So that's good. Self-service portal. and the administrative website. So those are both working. Not sure why. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong path, but that's the directory I see, not the same path that they provide there. Anyway, so the components are working is the point here. So now let's deploy the client. So this is our new client setting. So let's deploy that to an existing machine. Now on my existing machine, okay, so this is the client management to enable. I'm going to set it to more aggressive than 90 minutes to 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to need to deploy this. And I'm going to set this to 15 minutes. Evaluate this. This is just a lab, so then we'll do our operational collections. If you're not familiar with operational collections, it's a PowerShell script in the TechNet gallery. If you do a Google search for SCCM operational collections, you run this PowerShell script on your site server and you get all of these sweet collections that you can use for various things. Now, they're not set to dynamically update, so you need to look at that, but at any rate, so we deploy the policy. And if we go to that collection, we should see that policy showing up. Okay. Not sure why it shows 2. I don't think I deployed 2. Why did it deploy 2? Okay, so we need to, let's see. Oh, you know what? I may have done that already. So let's delete the duplicates here. We don't want duplication of stuff. All Windows 10 workstation run every, let's say 15 minutes. Okay, that's that. We don't deploy the other one because that one's busted. So now our client machine. All right, so now we need to look at our client settings. We've configured and validated things. So now let's look at our client settings. Before we get to that, however, just a second here. Okay, so for our client settings, there's a correction here. So it turns out that for the current technical preview for 1909 as well as the technical preview for 1905, you actually have to be running your SCCM environment in native mode to test the actual client settings. So right now my lab is not in native mode, so I'm using self-signed certificate. So the reason why you have to do this is if you notice here in the log file. So if we go to C Windows CCM logs, notice this error here. It finds a management point, but it's unable to connect to the MBAM recovery service management point. So this is an error. So if you go over to Windows Noob, so let's look at Windows Noob. He actually calls this out. So he has a write-up here on Windows Noob where he goes through the entire process as well for 1905, and this is still true for 1909. Essentially, you're required to be in PKI native mode for SCCM. Again, my lab is not configured for that. I'll include some links in the description to enable that. So we're not going to be able to test our client. We can do the push of the MBAM agent. So the MBAM agent is installed properly. So if we go to control panel, programs and features, the MBAM agent is for sure installed, but because we're not in native mode, we're not going to be able to do an actual encryption. And by the way, on a virtual machine, you're not able to do the encryption anyway. So we would have to have a physical machine. So I would suggest going over to Windows Noob. I'm going to link this in the reference and go through his article on setting up PKI, and then you can test the actual client on a physical machine. The MBAM encryption. So he talks about that here. So obviously here's the log files for the installation, and here's what he calls out here. So of course the details about the connection to the management point for MBAM. and notice it finds it here. Down here further, troubleshooting. So under the troubleshooting section on Windows Noob, he has a call out here. So when testing the technical preview release, make sure your client agent is using 1905, and in our case 1909, and that it is in PKI mode. So otherwise you'll get this message here like we're seeing on our client machines, unable to find a suitable recovery service management point. Also, he calls out here that you need real hardware to test the encryption settings. It won't work on virtual machines. Basically, you'll get the MBAM pop-up screen once you're in PKI mode, but it won't actually kick off the encryption. It will fail like you see here in the screenshot. And that's true. I've confirmed it. I've seen that before on virtuals, even though the virtual machine has a TPM chip. So that's something to keep in mind. So we need to be in native mode. Going back to our requirements, that needs to be a prerequisite in order to test the client deployment. Okay, so log files. So the MBAM server log files, we reviewed those. The client log files are also here. Under C Windows, there's two. Bitlocker Management Group Policy Handler and Bitlocker Management Handler. Those are the two log files to review the MBAM status. So again, we're not in native mode, so we can't test those things. Now let's look, however, at the earlier we looked at the websites for MBAM. Once it installs the web installer, you'll notice that it creates a self-service portal and a help desk portal. Now, one thing I didn't mention here is, and let me just kind of demonstrate this to you so you understand. Okay, so let's demonstrate with the self-service portal, and I'll explain this in a second. So essentially, you notice if you click on any virtual directory under the default website, it's not like it used to be with standalone MBAM. So this is integrated with SCCM, so it creates a virtual directory for the help desk and the self-service portal, as well as the core services. The core services virtual directory looks different now than it does with standalone. So integrated with MBAM, it looks different. But the point I want to get to is that if you access this website, so once you create your certificates, so let's look at this self-service portal. So once you create your actual SSL certificates and you run it in native mode, you issue certificate to the server, that's the web installer. Obviously, when you issue certificates, it needs to be the fully qualified domain name in a real production environment. So we need to obviously test those URLs. So if we click on this and to test it and we log in, you notice you'll keep getting prompted even though you're typing the correct password. However, if we do the short name, it will work without issue, correct? But if we do the long name, the fully qualified domain name, we get prompted and it doesn't work, even if you're typing the password correctly. And this is still a known issue. I thought this would have been resolved by now. You basically need to go to the self-service portal or whatever virtual directory you have, click on Windows Authentication, or sorry, not Windows Authentication, click on the authentication here, double click on that, highlight the Windows Authentication, make sure that's enabled, and click on the Providers tab here. Essentially, this NTLM setting needs to be moved to a higher level, higher up. Okay, now when we access the same self-service portal with the fully qualified domain name, we'll get prompted. And now we are actually able to log in with the fully qualified domain name. Okay, so we need to repeat that on all of the websites, virtual directories for the different components of the MBAM functionality. So let's go to Windows Authentication for our help desk. Make sure NTLM is the highest level. That's good. And let's do the same for the core services and make sure NTLM is higher. So now we check the core services, server demo. So now the URL, this is to validate that the MBAM Core Services URL is correct. So essentially when you have a task sequence, this is what the client communicates with when it talks back to the MBAM server to escrow the recovery keys. Now what you'll have is in your task sequence, this is going to change for future versions. So now if we look at our task sequence, so for existing clients, it's not a big deal. However, when you're running a task sequence and you call the invoke MBAM client deployment script, notice the URL path that is currently configured for MBAM standalone currently. So you notice it has, the fully qualified server name, and it's SSL configured, so port 443 / MBAM Recovery and Hardware Services, Core Services. So that parameter will change. So now what it's going to be, I suspect this is pretty much going to be the new URL is going to be this, right? And of course it'd be HTTPS again once you issue those certificates. So this would change to this for that step in the. So basically I have in my task sequence here, I have it disabled, but you would install the MBAM agent, install the KB article, configure the startup to happen immediately. I'm not imagining that you're not going to need this status reporting. We'll have to test that once it gets released. Once Microsoft releases this to general availability, and that's your task sequence component of that. Okay, so that has changed. So under known issues, I'm going to list that here. You must move the Intel and provider under each virtual directory for Windows Authentication to the top option. So it has to be at the top. Otherwise, when you attempt to log in with the fully qualified domain name, it will not work. I've also included here the critical point for the core services URL. It looks like that has changed. And so that it needs to be referenced in the task sequence. Also, critical point here, the MBAM client, if you want to test the actual MBAM client deployment, it actually needs, SCCM needs to be in native mode. So my environment in the lab is not in native mode. So refer to the Windows Noob article here. He actually has in his documentation here how to install PKI. Microsoft also has a blog here on how to deploy PKI. His article is pretty good too because it has some steps in there on how to convert from self-signed certificate based to PKI. So that is actually a pretty involved process to get that going. And then the other part here is making sure we have the ASP.NET MVC4 installed, and a link to the TechNet article from Microsoft. So I think we've covered the majority of things that we can at this time. So can't really test the client settings, right? I tested the core services URL, that works. The help desk and self-service portals are working, right? So if we just one more time, just to kind of show that the help desk would be right. So this is the help desk portal, and again, just make sure that you have those IIS settings configured to allow it to, when you're validating, that it comes up correctly and processes properly. So this is good progress from Microsoft on, the improvements for SCCM 1909 technical preview. So I look forward to seeing this in production. I know there's a lot of other missing pieces. One of the things that we're still not clear about is migration questions. So if you have an existing MBAM client, I imagine that obviously you can't have a client point to two different MBAM environments. So you would have to turn off the legacy one, and so that config manager can manage it. So I look forward to seeing what the future holds for the MBAM features native to SCCM console. And so thank you for joining. I appreciate you reviewing and watching the YouTube video today. Click on the subscribe button when you get a chance. Comment, give me some feedback on anything you didn't understand, and you can follow me on Twitter at Nathan J. Bridges on Twitter, or you can find me on my Facebook site as well, facebook.com/modern deployment. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I appreciate your time.